Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Hell's Kitchen Head Chefs Only, following episode 2, the first service of the season and the first elimination. And it was a mostly standard premiere episode in the sense that you had a pretty rocky service with Ramsey kicking out both teams despite them doing pretty well across the challenges. Sort of interesting result there, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 18 people to talk about, and let's waste some more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 18, we have the first boot of the season, and here we have Amber. And this is a largely unsurprising result here, considering Amber already stood out from a relatively weak signature dish, being the only person to not get a 4 or a 5, which already made her stand out there. But then mixing that in with her having a pretty bad service on the fish station, making mistake after mistake, it just made her the pretty clear weak link to be taken out here, especially considering everyone else had at least more pros going on. It seemed like Amber was pretty clearly the weakest chef here, both from a actual cooking perspective, but also from a service perspective. Even though in the grand scheme of Hell's Kitchen, she isn't that bad, I feel like she kind of suffers from being on a pretty strong cast that made her stand out in a not so great way. And again, I feel like with her having like these knocks against her, it just made it pretty easy for Ramsey to take her out relatively early here. So again, not too surprised by this outcome, but she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 18. And with that, we have 17 chefs left in the game to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But number 17, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on, is Corbin. And Corbin was kind of a weird choice here. He was someone who I did have pegged as a relatively early boot, considering the circumstances here. And to be fair, his service isn't entirely bad, or it's pretty clear that Shant made more mistakes on the starter station during the course of that service. But even so, I don't think Corbin came off that well on the show either, where he immediately made a mistake after talking about how he doesn't crack under pressure and that he's cool as a cucumber. And well, again, Shant ends up overshadowing him by the end of it. The fact that that's Corbin's only content here when it felt pretty unnecessary is pretty bad in Corbin's eyes, and considering that I was already pretty low on him last week, I feel like he's someone who's pretty unlikely to win in my eyes, where considering that he already got pretty minimal content and the content that he did get was kind of dunking on him, I did decide to leave him here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another person who I was also pretty low on last week, but now they had a pretty bad service, and that is Magali. And Magali was someone I was already not feeling that great about considering the content she got during the premiere, but I feel like this episode didn't do her any favors either, where she ended up having a pretty bad service all in all and ends up getting nominated here in a spot to where she volunteered to go up. And while Amber was pretty clearly the target in that spot, I still feel like Magali is not getting the best content in the world, and I feel like with the fact that she's already like someone who has been put up on the block and someone who is already not really impressing me from a cooking standpoint or from a edit standpoint, I feel like she's another person who I'm not feeling that great about at this current point, which is why she's here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have another person who I am not that impressed by, and here we have Michael. Now, Michael was another person who I was already pretty low on after episode 1, and I feel like this episode was more of the same here, where the one pro you can give him is that he did do pretty well during the actual punishment pass challenge, but beyond that, he has a pretty rocky service where he ends up screwing up the lamb after he had literally done lamb pretty well during his signature dish, and he ends up getting nominated for this, which is not a particularly great look there. Not to mention that he's getting caught up with Egypt and having a rivalry with him there. I feel like Michael's someone who is not really being propped up all that much, and mixing that in with his bad service, I feel like I have to leave him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have the person who was at the bottom of last week's ranking, but now they're a couple spots higher, and here we have Brandon. And Brandon's another one who I'm still not feeling that great about considering how bad his premiere was. But again, this was technically a good episode from him from a cooking standpoint, where he does win the punishment pass challenge and ends up having an okay service even though he was on tableside. So I feel like from a pure cooking standpoint, I feel like Brandon should probably be a couple spots higher. But at the end of the day, I feel like from an ed standpoint, he's still not there for me. I feel like a lot of his content is pretty circumstantial, where the main reason why he got as much focus as he did was because he won the punishment pass challenge, where beyond that, I feel like I was pretty underwhelmed by him, and that's why he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and this person has gone down compared to last week, but we do have Britney. And Britney's kind of the opposite of Brandon, where I thought Britney got an alright episode 1, where she got a lot of credit for winning the signature dish challenge, even though she wasn't even the last person to score there, which I felt like was good content for her, but I did question whether it was circumstantial. And I feel like this episode just confirmed to me that it was circumstantial, where it didn't feel like the show was going out of its way to prop her up here, where, again, I feel like this episode was pretty bad from her, where she ends up being in the bottom 2 during the punishment pass challenge, with a lot of the team complaining that she did pretty bad during that. But again, she does okay during the actual service, even though she was on table side, similar to Brandon here. But I feel like Britney's someone who I'm still very much on the fence on, where it feels like a lot of her content is there simply because it has to be there. Where in episode 1, she's someone who got injured during the challenge and they had to show that as a way of building stakes. And then in episode 2, they had to show her again because her dish sucked during the punishment pass challenge. So I feel like I'm not getting the best sense from Britney at this point, where it seems like the show is giving mixed messages and it's not really going out of its way to prop her up, which is why she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and this person had a very rocky episode from a cooking standpoint, but we do have Shant. And Shant obviously had a terrible service here where he ends up making tons of mistakes on the starter station and ends up being in the bottom 2 during the elimination, whereas between him and Amber here. And while it's pretty clear that he was staying over Amber, I feel like the fact that he's already been put up on the block, the fact that Ramsey was seriously considering cutting him this early in the game is not a great sign for his prospects moving forward here. Where I feel like the fact that he already has this spotlight on him for his bad service is probably something that will carry over with him moving forward. And it wouldn't shock me if down the road he is someone that continues to struggle and is eventually eliminated because of that. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't really have him too much higher. And that's why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and this is someone who I still don't feel that great about, but I feel like this episode was at least a little better for them, and here we have Yuri. And I think Yuri is still someone who's probably going to be a villain on the season, someone who's probably not going to win by the end of it, and someone who will probably rub some people the wrong way. Where even in this episode, we see him complaining a lot about Shant due to his bad service, and I feel like that'll be a lot of Yuri's content moving forward. But again, he does have an alright service, he doesn't really make any mistakes there, and is able to get through it alright. So I feel like considering he had a decent enough service, especially compared to some people we already talked about, I did decide to elevate him slightly, even though he's still not someone I'm feeling that great about. So he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I found to be middle of the road last episode, and they're still middle of the road this episode, and here we have Anarie. Now Anarie is someone you can argue should be lower on this list, considering she wanted to have her dish selected for the punishment pass challenge, and not only did not get that, but she ended up being in the bottom 2, which is obviously not great. And even moving forward, you have her confessional about how this isn't about egos, it's about teamwork for the services, only for the service to be pretty bad. So again, I think it's pretty middle of the road content here. You can argue that it's lower because of how bad she did, relatively speaking, during the punishment pass challenge. But I feel like her service was fine enough. She didn't really make any major mistakes there. And I feel like with me not really having much of a reason to knock her too much, I did decide to leave her around the same spot as she was last week, so she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who is pretty middle of the road, even though they actually moved up a couple spots from last week, but we do have Amanda. And Amanda's episode was fine. She was mostly there, only getting one confessional about how Britney's dish during the punishment pass was bad, and then beyond that, her service was fine. Not too much to say here. I feel like Amanda's someone who I don't really have that great of a sense of, and her placement on this list is not so much her going up, but more so other people going down. But at the end of the day, I feel like she's still someone who, again, will probably be there for a bit, but beyond that, I'm not feeling the greatest about her, so she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who is remaining around the same spot compared to last week, and here we have Joe. And again, Joe's episode was mostly fine here. Now he does make a mistake during the service where he messes up some salmon, and that's actually the thing that causes Ramsey to kick out the entire blue team here, which obviously isn't the best look, but really is more so the straw that broke the camel's back, considering there were other people that made bigger mistakes. But again, I feel like Joe's content was mostly fine here, where he does pretty well during the punishment pass challenge despite not winning. And again, while he does make that one mistake, and he also talks about Egypt, like kind of being overbearing, I feel like his episode here was mostly fine, not too much to say, which is why he's remaining around the same spot at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this person has gone down quite a bit from last week, where I feel like this person is being presented in a pretty different light than what the premiere led on, but we do have Egypt. And obviously this was a pretty bad look for Egypt here, where during the punishment pass challenge, he ends up doing pretty poorly there, being the bottom 2. And then beyond that, you have him really getting a lot of over-the-top content of him trying to be the leader for the blue team, only for people to be annoyed by him, which is obviously not great. And he also makes some mistakes during the service, like messing up a Wellington. So it's kind of strange that he is trying to be the leader despite him not being the greatest chef in the world, which is kind of jarring considering episode 1 presented him as being a somewhat serious chef, with him being more willing to study the menu and to lead up to the first service. So I'm pretty conflicted over where to stand with Egypt at this point, and it's really his strong premiere that's keeping him from being lower on this list. Though considering what we saw from the next time on, it wouldn't shock me if Egypt will just continue down this direction in the future of being this over-the-top person, someone who continues to irritate the rest of his team, and obviously that will cause him to slip further and further from contention. But again, I feel like for now, considering he did at least have one good episode, I did decide to leave him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and from this point on, I would consider this top tier of people who I feel pretty good about as contenders, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 6, we probably have the person who has the most potential to move up in the future, even though their performance from this episode wasn't the best, but we do have Hannah. And Hannah was someone who I was pretty impressed by after the premiere, and I feel like this episode was not the worst look for her either. Now, the main reason why she is at the bottom of this top tier is that we do see her making a mistake during the service where we see Ramsay calling her out for stabbing some chicken, which admittedly is not that big of a mistake. It's not like she actually screwed up a dish. And I think there was enough countering it to where it's not that bad of a look, where for one, you had her being mentioned earlier for making a good dish, and then she also gets to talk about in confessional how it's pretty embarrassing to be called out for a mistake. So again, I feel like it kind of redeems itself by the end of it, but still the fact that she did make a mistake during the service and that was shown in the show is not the greatest look in my eyes. And while I could see her moving up in future weeks, I did have to leave her here at number 6 for now. Now moving on to number 5, and these next few people are all people who I was pretty high on after the premiere, only to get understated presences across this episode, which you would think is a fault considering obviously you want the winner to be shown whenever possible, but I don't really see it that way, where I feel like the fact that they didn't get much focus during the service probably means that they did fine during the service, that they avoided mistakes for the most part. And I feel like really it's probably a sign that they'll probably pop off later. And it's just a matter of ordering these people. But number 5, we do have Kyle. And again, Kyle is someone who kind of fits this grouping, where he's someone who had a pretty fine service being assigned to tableside, and that's pretty much it. Now, obviously, it's not great that he didn't get more beyond that with no confessionals, but I feel like he's someone who, again, had a fine service and doesn't really do anything to make Ramses irritated by him. And obviously, considering the fact that they had a solid episode 1, I did decide to keep them relatively high at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have a similar case, and that is Lulu. And Lulu's another person who has a pretty fine service, doesn't really get much focus outside of a confessional about how being in the service is a dream and that they want to get the jitters out and to rock it. And obviously, while the service itself goes pretty wrong, the fact that Lulu herself doesn't make any mistakes is probably a good sign for her here, where again, she's a pretty consistent performer, someone who puts her head down and is able to have a pretty solid service while still getting a confessional to explain her perspective on things. So again, while it's not much, I feel like the fact that she had a good enough premiere, mixing in the fact that she had a solid service in this episode, was enough to keep her here around number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this person actually had a bigger episode, all things considered, but still someone who I'm looking at as a pretty solid contender, and that is Wit. And Wit was obviously someone who was featured quite a bit in this episode, where she ends up winning the punishment pass challenge despite facing a decent amount of adversity there, where we see her screwing up the salmon and having to fix that, and the fact that she's able to turn that around to the point where she wins the punishment pass is a pretty good sign there. And again, she also gets to talk a bit during the actual service about how she's a fast learner, and while the service itself goes off the rails, we don't see her making any mistakes there either, which is all pretty good there. She's another person that's able to put her head down and actually perform across the service. So again, I feel like she's someone who also fits into this grouping, but considering she had a bit more to do, considering that she won the punishment pass challenge, and considering she got to talk about being a fast learner before the service, I'm still feeling pretty good about Wit, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this person was someone I was pretty high on last week, and they did technically slide up to number 2 considering Egypt went down, and that person is Megan. And Megan got a bigger edit in this episode compared to the number 1 person, where she obviously got a decent amount of focus during the punishment pass challenge, where she does pretty well during that, where she talks about how you have to speak up for yourself, otherwise no one will do it for you, and we see her doing pretty well in the challenge despite her not winning. And again, she's another person that has a pretty quiet service, doesn't really get much to do there. But again, the assumption here is that she did pretty well in the service and that she didn't really do anything to upset Ramsay. So Megan is someone I'm still feeling pretty good about and someone who's not overly exposed, which is why she's here number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen, head chefs only at this point, is still Anthony. And Anthony perfectly encapsulates these people I've been talking about. Someone who had a pretty quiet episode, all things considered, where his only content comes after his team is kicked out, talking about how it's embarrassing to get kicked out of service. But I do feel like it works to his favor, considering that he's one of these people that wasn't show making many mistakes, that he was someone who put his head down, which is what I expected from him coming into the season. He seems to be one of the more serious chefs across this blue team, which I think is something that really works to his favor. And again, while him and some of these other chefs we already talked about, who had pretty understated episodes here, I do think it works out for them considering the service was presented as a disaster. And the fact that they didn't get much to do there is probably a sign that the show didn't want to harp too much on the things that went well during that service. And I feel like at the end of the day, these are all people who will probably get more content moving forward as they're able to further demonstrate their cooking abilities or their leadership abilities. So again, I feel like considering the fact that these people all got solid premieres while still like being shown as competent chefs throughout are all pretty good signs for all these people, but I still feel the highest on Anthony. I feel like he's the person who I had at number one after the premiere, and I feel like he didn't really do anything to cause me to have him lower, which is why he's still here at number one. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really help to hit the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Survivor 47 and Big Brother 26 as that comes to a close, so you can expect content on those shows. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.